Hello everyone. Just recently, Ironblood got their first ultra-rare aircraft carrier, Fritz Rumey. And she certainly wasn't who I was expecting for their first. I thought for sure they'd do Europa. Rumey belongs to a set of rather unorthodox and obscure designs from 1942, known as the Flugzeugkreuzers, or aircraft cruisers in English, which will be the focus of this video. We'll look at the various designs from smallest to largest, and I'll throw in my thought on their viability as well at the end. In early 1942, the Kriegsmarine began looking at new ship designs to help resolve the lack of air cover that plagued their fleet. However, they couldn't keep their commerce raiding addiction at bay for 5 minutes, and so they launched a design study for a ship that could do both. What came out of it was designs for a cruiser/battleship carrier hybrid that could join Kriegsmarine fleets and provide air cover, but also act as a solo raider, hunting convoys inside its prodigious range with high speed. The smallest of these was the Flugdeckkreuzer E4, although the name is a bit misleading. This and its immediate successor are basically aircraft carriers. The only thing cruiser about this one is the 4 single 150mm guns used for hitting surface ships. At 12,750 tons and an overall length of 188 meters long, it was very much a light carrier that charged around at 34 knots from 120,000 shaft horsepower. Protection was nothing special by carrier standards, but given it was a light carrier who typically failed to meet these standards, that's a compliment. Air wing was suitably German, that is to say small, about 10 to 18 planes, and to be comprised of navalised Bf-109s and Ju-87s. The next step up is the E5 version. This one is larger, around the size of the pre-war fleet carriers at 19,150 tons, though a little on the short side at only 210 metres long overall. Engine power was upgraded to 180,000 horsepower, increasing its speed to a blistering 35.5 knots. Protection remained the same, going from great for a CVL to merely standard for a full-on CV, as did the air wing of 18 planes, being far and away the worst of any full-size flat top. For comparison's sake, the Illustrious class doubled that capacity, tripled it with a deck park, and the Yorktowns in some cases could quintuple it. The 150mm guns were now twins, doubling anti-surface firepower, and a few extra 88 and 20mm AA guns were added, though that did little to help the underwhelming AA suite. From here we switch over to the much larger Grossflugzeugkreuzers, which make up the bulk of the designs. They completely shed any implications that they might just be carriers, and fully embrace their unimpressive hybridness. The first Grossflugzeugkreuzer, A2, is the basis for Fritz Rumey. Size has increased to 40,000 tons and 245 meters long. Speed returns to 34 knots and will remain that way for the rest of the designs, while the range has remained a consistent and overambitious 18,000 miles at 19 knots. Air wing has increased. It's now 24 planes instead of 18. Of course, the most striking feature is the new main gun turret on the front, a quadruple 203mm piece to accompany the 8 twin 150s and also 8 twin 105s, giving a serviceable level of AA. A2A is next, being a slight reworking of the previous design. It's slightly longer at 250 meters, but displacement and 210,000 horsepower engines remain the same. While the previous design had battleship level 150mm deck, this has been reduced to 100mm, in order to double the belt to 200. The rest of the changes lie in the armament. The main guns have been replaced with a pair of Scharnhorst turrets, and has also gained 10 pairs of 20mm light AA guns at the cost of losing a pair of twin 150s. If you're familiar with World of Warships, this is the one Hildebrand is most likely based off, albeit with a few wargaming liberties. Like moving the conning tower to the side, like on a traditional carrier, instead of being in the middle of the flight deck, which otherwise might be a problem if you make a mistake in your landing attempt and have to go around again for another try. This is the only one of these designs that does that too. It's so weird. Moving on, Grossflugzeugkreuzer A3. This is one of the big ones. 280 meters long, 70,000 tons, 280,000 horsepower, steam turbines only, no mixed diesel steam like before. Protection has taken a decent upgrade, with 250mm along the belt and 150 on the deck. The main armament remains the same, as does most of the anti-aircraft suite, though the 20mm aren't here, likely because A2 is the newest design and they felt the extra guns were necessary. That missing pair of 150s is back, and it's gained a new pair of triple torpedo tubes because at this point why not? The range has been upgraded to 20,000 miles because apparently it wasn't long enough before, and the air wing has grown to a staggering 32 aircraft. The final design we're looking at today, A4, is a modification of A3. Most of the ship is the same. The only real changes are a thinning of the deck armour to 120mm, and a reconfiguring of the main battery into a single quadruple turret instead of two triples. Despite the lighter main armament and deck, the ship still remains at a displacement of 70,000 tons. Maybe there's some undocumented changes elsewhere. So let's talk viability. These were just design studies, never really a high priority build. Likely just busy work to keep the German naval architects sharp and out of the meat grinder called the Eastern Front, but let's do it anyway. As a carrier, they are lacking. Like most German carriers, the air wing is smaller than their contemporaries, but these are just sad. I understand that about a quarter of the ship cannot be used for hangar and flight deck due to the guns, but still. A3 and 4 are slightly longer and significantly outweigh the Royal Navy's unbuilt Malta-class carriers. But their air wings are outnumbered by 2.5 to 3.3 times. Credit where it's due, they're pretty hardy for a carrier, barring E5, thanks to their thick armour values, but I question how useful a 250mm belt will be on a carrier. The thick decks on those that have it should in theory make them pretty resilient to dive bombing though. Can't say a lot about torpedo attacks. And it doesn't really matter if your air wing is tiny and gets shredded. As gunboats, they're lacking too. The smaller flight deck cruisers are more in line with carriers, so obviously not great, but the hybrids suck too. They are massively undergunned and poorly armoured for their size. A2A is probably the best equipped proportionally, but it's still 6 280mm rifles and 200mm of belt on a large 40,000 ton hull. Most battleships built around that time were around that size and outclass it in both metrics. It's worse for all the others who are much more disproportionate. And really, that's the problem with hybrids as a whole. I'm all for roll compression when it works. Look at how the lines between torpedo and dive bombers began disappearing by the end of World War II, or how modern fighter aircraft are becoming more and more generalist. But sometimes the roles are just fundamentally incompatible. Carriers want to operate at range where guns are too inaccurate to matter, or outside their range entirely. But being in gun range runs the risk of a shell hitting a plane whilst it's being loaded and causing a chain of explosions. It also makes superstructure large, bulky and easy to hit too, due to the space required for the aviation facilities. Not to mention, you have to carry large caliber shells, propellant for those shells, fuel for the planes, and the plane's ordnance all on the same ship. A lot of stuff just waiting to cook off. You also need to provide space for both fire control and shell handling for guns, and hangar and flight deck for planes. It's just too much for one ship and drastically cuts into its capabilities. To use Fritz Rumey as an example, her carrier capabilities are equivalent to a ship a third or less her size, as is her artillery. I'd argue she's less than the sum of her parts as a designer. To quote the Royal Navy's Director of Naval Gunnery, when faced with a hybrid version of the Lion battleships, functions and requirements of a carrier and of a surface gun platform are entirely incompatible. The conception of these designs is evidently the result of an unresolved contest between a conscious acceptance of aircraft and a subconscious desire for a 1914 fleet. These abortions are the result of a psychological maladjustment. The necessary readjustments should result from a proper reanalysis of the whole question. What would be balanced for a fleet in 1945, 1950, or 1955? What the fuck was that voice? As for actually building them, they'd most likely have to be new builds. They could have maybe converted Tirpitz, or had her take over while one of the Scharnhorsts went in, but that likely would have had been a compromised design. There's no way it'd be worth a rebuild on an existing ship to the design specs of the smaller designs, much less for A3 and 4. Not to mention that these were designed around the time Allied bombing raids were beginning to ramp up. An active shipyard building new capital units is going to present a juicy target. It'd also be taking resources away from other branches that needed them given the context. They definitely wouldn't survive Hitler's bitch fit in 1943, they'd be scrapped immediately. There's also the factor of time. Even if they get laid down immediately, by the time they're complete and commissioned into service, the war is likely to be over. And if it's somehow not, they'll be too little too late. Around the same time these were being designed, the Royal Navy began its 1942 Light Fleet Carrier programme. So now these ships are going to have to deal with new Colossus, Majestic and potentially Centaur class carriers, supplementing the existing carrier fleet, plus the new large ones also under construction. And also whatever the Americans are bringing as well. All of which have larger air wings with better planes. There's a non-zero chance German pilots would be at that point facing Sea Furies and Bearcats in their 109s. If I was a German pilot, I'd just throw my hands up and go home. This shit ain't worth it. Benefit of the doubt, maybe the Me-155 stays a carrier fighter so they're not wholly outclassed. But it's still not going to be a fun or fair fight for them. No 262 either. You're never getting that thing's takeoff distance or low-speed handling to acceptable levels for carrier ops. Especially not these ones with the cut-down flight decks. So that's the basis of Fritz Rumey, and her family tree. She's certainly a unique, if odd pick. Given she's a hybrid, and a rather questionable one at that, I'd have thought for sure she'd be based on the A4 design, using its sheer massiveness to secure the role. Usually URs have history story important being most advanced to their faction, or some mix of all three to justify their position. This is the only one that's really gotten a raised eyebrow out of me. Normally I don't really care about whether a UR is worthy or not, but this one's a bit weird. But what do you think? Would she have been worth it IRL, or is she the textbook definition of a German wonder weapon? Or somewhere in between? Leave your thoughts below. And until next time, fair winds and following seas.